Good morning, Prof. Mike. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
My pleasure.
Thanks. So this week in our course, we're looking at the capabilities of governments to respond to contemporary challenges. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the policy capacity framework and how does that improve our understanding on the capabilities of government?
Right. Well, I think it's quite an important topic, and it's one that until recently, there hasn't been a lot of detail on it. So I think if you go back and look at the literature, not just in public policy, but also around governance, organizational theory, and the old sort of political economy literature as well. There has always been this link between capacity and policy success and failure, right? So some idea that having a lot of capacity or high capacity contributes to policy success, whereas having poor capacity leads in some way to policy failure or less success and so on. But when you look at those literatures, they tended to focus on different aspects of what kind of capabilities and what kind of competences were required in order to be able to say that you had high capacity. So again, if you look at, say, the old state capacity literature, obviously the focus there was on very high level sort of systemic capacity. You look at some of the literature on governance and organizational theory, it's sort of focusing a little bit more at the meso level around organizational issues. And then you have a literature around topics like policy analytical capacity and so on, which focused at a more kind of micro level. So when you put those things together, you can either get confused about it, so you're not sure which one of these capacities is important, or if you need all three, or if there's more dimensions and more aspects to it. But you can see already that there's at least one side of the equation has to do with capacity or capabilities at different levels of government or different levels of society, and that they are somehow linked to different competences that individuals, organizations, and political systems have. So one of the things that we did a few years ago with colleagues in Singapore and in Hong Kong was to try to think about those a little bit more and try to be a little bit more systematic about sketching out exactly what the relationship was between these kinds of competences and capabilities and what sorts of capacities resulted from that. So if you want to put it into a kind of shorthand, the shorthand that we used was capacity equals competence plus capability. Mm-hmm. So you get a variety of different capacities which are linked to competences or skills of individuals, organizations, and so on, and also to the kinds of resources that those individuals, organizations, and systems had. And if you do that, a nice sort of simple way to portray that is, and is very common in the policy sciences, as you know, is to use a matrix of some sort. And in this case, we felt that you could have a relatively parsimonious type of matrix, which would be a 3x3 matrix. So one side of it being those sorts of competences or skills that are required, and the other side being the capabilities or resources that you needed as well. And that would generate 9 different types of capacities, and that you should be able to assess not only sort of policymaking circumstances, but also governments and governance type relationships by looking at those capacities.
A logical extension of the capacity framework has been this notion of critical capacities. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the critical capacity argument.
Well, that critical capacity argument is really an outgrowth of that initial attempt to come up with a better kind of scheme for understanding what capacities were all about. And it addresses a sort of further question that's, that arises as soon as you have that kind of description in place. It's still this link between those kinds of categories and the idea of policy success and failure. One of the questions that we asked ourselves was, okay, now that we have a better sense of all these different kinds of capacity, how many of them or what kinds of them are required for policy success? And one way to look at that is to kind of evade the question in a way, and you can sort of say, well, you need all of them, and you need all of them in equal measure, and you need all of them at equally high levels in order to be successful. And if you don't, then you'll have a failure. We thought, though, that a better way to look at that, and was a little bit more precise, would be to see if there were some which were more significant than others, so that even in situations where you might not have high levels of all of these different kinds of capacity, as long as you had high enough levels in certain ones, that you would probably have policy success. So we like to call those the critical capacities for success. They're also, if you look at it the other way, they're kind of the Achilles heels for failure, in the sense that if you don't have them, then you're likely or more likely to fail. So the regulation and governance article and some of the other ones that we did afterwards, based on that, we're trying to get at this question. So what exactly are these capacities, these critical capacities, or these Achilles heels? The regulation and governance article looks at the question at a fairly high level, because it's really talking about governance relationships and the kinds of capacities that are required for specific kinds of institutional governance relationships, that is, between institutions and societal actors and so on, that are required if those governance arrangements are going to work or function effectively. So if you think of the standard kinds of governance arrangements, or different types of governance arrangements that people like Mark Considine and also Oliver Williamson and others have looked at, they tend to have a fairly small number of typical governance relationships. So market-based governance relationships, hierarchies, which are government or state-based ones, or civil society type organizations or relationships. So what we thought was that if you looked at those 9 different types of capacities, and you looked at each of those relatively small number of governance relationships, that you could probably identify certain capacities which were really prerequisites for those governance arrangements to succeed. So if you think of market-based relations, for instance, well, state capacities in an organizational sense are not all that important, because it's the market which is really delivering the goods and services and so on, not the state. That's different from the hierarchical form of governance arrangements, where it is the state which is delivering. So in the case of the hierarchical governance arrangement, you would think that the critical capacities would be ones around organizations, and would be ones around the management aspects of organizations, because those are the ones that are really delivering the services. So even if you had very high levels of, say, individual analytical capacity, that's not as important as having high levels of high quality managers, public managers who can effectively deal with government organizations and deliver services to the public. In the case of the market relationships, it would be the reverse, right? So you don't need as much of the organizational capacities, but you do need these analytical capacities, because you have to be monitoring the market. You have to make sure that the market is actually delivering the goods and services that they're supposed to. If they're not, you have to design interventions that can accomplish that, which usually involve manipulating market actors in fairly subtle ways, through the tax code and so on. So you really need, in that case, the critical capacities in that case would be at this sort of analytical level. And the argument was in that paper that you can do that with sort of each of these different kinds of governance relationships that you can identify. We did another book recently that came out in 2020, which was talking about collaboration in public service delivery. And we looked at more than three of these governance relationships, because we also looked at things like co-production and certification and things like that, and applied the same logic to them. Could we identify in each of these cases some key core capacities, without which an attempt to govern through those kinds of relationships would probably fail, or one in which, if you were really serious about utilizing that kind of relationship, that you could build capacity in those areas and therefore enhance the possibility of success. So that's the idea of the critical capacities, and I think you can see how that flows out of the matrix that we had developed earlier.
What specifically can governments do to ameliorate some of these critical capacities? Can they be addressed, or is that something that governments just have to work around?
I think within certain parameters they can be addressed. I mean, if for instance, you need a very high level of organizational resources, and these are very expensive, and you don't have the kinds of tax base that would allow you to support that, then you're going to have problems working within that. But so that sort of sets an outside limit to what you can do. But within that, I think you can certainly make the right or the wrong decision about what kinds of capacities to strengthen. Something that struck me a few years ago was when we had been doing some work with the Asia Development Bank, and we had been talking about this model or this way of looking at capacities with them. And some of the people in some of their research units in Manila had said, well, this actually answered a problem that they had identified, but they really couldn't get a handle on, which was that, they had been spending quite a lot of money in many of the different developing countries that are within the ADB mandate. And they had really been trying to build capacity at the individual level around analytical and improved analysis. So they were, for instance, identifying individuals and then sending them off for training so they could be policy analysts, and they would get training in a range of fairly high level statistical techniques and so on. And they really weren't seeing the kind of bang for the buck from that effort in capacity building in terms of the results that they were getting for better policy making and better governance arrangements or better project management on the ground. What they realized, I think, was that maybe that those efforts in capacity building would still be useful and might still pay off at some point, but that it probably would have been better to have focused on, say, better public management, better organizational design, enhancing the organizational resources of some of the governments they were dealing with, rather than flooding them with individual analysts who, in many cases, for instance, would not have good data or the kind of evidence that they required in order to carry out those kinds of analyses. So governments, again, can make mistakes, right? They can build capacity in the wrong places. To a certain extent, you can say that's okay, as long as you're better than you were before, eventually these things will fill in. But it could take some time, and if you are pressed for time or you'd like to get better results faster, then it would be better to be able to target the critical capacities and target the capacity building activities to those capacities rather than to other ones which are secondary or tertiary.
It also serves, as you said, as a heuristic tool, right? As a diagnostic tool, ex ante, to figure out what of these kinds of critical capacities that are required to achieve a particular task successfully. So you could do that ex ante.
Right. We had thought at one point, this was more sort of in the bailiwick of some of my colleagues who work on ex post and ex ante evaluation and so on, but they had thought of using the initial 3x3 matrix as a kind of evaluative template for looking at the existing capacities that different governments had, or that were in different sectors, or what have you, so that you would be able to get, in a way, almost a kind of numerical score for what the capacities, what the competences were at multiple levels, what sort of resources they had, and an overall kind of score for the capacity of the government. I haven't done that, but I know that they've been trying to do that, and I think that should be possible with that kind of tool.